over time, like our portfolio was growing. We used the BRRRR method to do that. And at some point, I was working for the government at the time, and I was like, I feel like I can do a better job than these like slowpoke old guys that we've been hiring to do it. I've been, behind the scenes in our business for a long time. But really what the impetus was for me was when we got sued. And I was like, we're paying all this money to lawyers and we still got sued. There's got to be a better way. And the way I felt that a lot of other attorneys were approaching things was poorly for two reasons. One, it was very reactionary. It was, set up this LLC, and then if there's a problem, we'll be happy to defend you in the lawsuit. So they're kind of like double dipping in a sense. And then on the flip side, it was very just like LLC and entity centric. And we had an LLC, we had insurance, and that didn't prevent the lawsuit from happening. And so what I really dove deep into was figuring out, how can I leverage legal? How can I use legal to just prevent this stuff in the first place? I don't want it to just protect me. I don't want to ever deal with this again. Yeah. And so that was what made me about 5 years ago go out, hang my shingle, and say, enough. I'm going to do this better than the other guys.
Interesting. What was that lawsuit based on?
So it was a situation where a contractor alleged he got hurt on our property. I shouldn't even say a contractor. It was like a handyman. It was the guy who we called that said, hey, can you go fix this light bulb or go spackle this thing? Mm-hmm. And it was years later, the relationship had just kind of fallen apart. Like not anything negative had happened. And if you deal with contractors, you probably have dealt with this, where you deal with someone, they're super reliable, and then they stop being reliable. So you start having to call other people, and then they start working with other people, and then it just fizzles out. Like there was no big explosion. There was no actual injury that happened. And unfortunately, I think this gentleman fell into an addiction issue, and he knew we were a pot. And so he sued us. He said he got hurt on our property. He fell off a ladder and he hurt his back, and he could no longer work anymore. And he was also, and the kicker for us is he was alleging that we were actually his employer. He was not a contractor. And so we also ordered him workers' comp. And we're just like, whoa. It just really was outside the realm of what we had perceived as where the asset protection risks were. Yeah. Because a lot of investors are anonymity, or not another investors, a lot of other attorneys, they're really pushing this anonymity approach. I'm like, this guy had our cell phone number. Right. This guy, I think, risk really stems from the people who are closest to you. It's kind of like a car accident, right? You're more likely to be in a car accident closer to your home because that's just where you're dealing with people all the time. And so I realized my biggest risks were my tenants, my contractors, my partners. And by kind of just turning a blind eye to that and just thinking my biggest risk is Joe Schmo who's going to slip and fall in front of my house, I was really, really exposed. And that's what that lawsuit proved.
Interesting. So not to dwell on that too much, but I'm interested now, using that as an example, because pretty much if you're a real estate investor, you're working with contractors, it goes hand in hand. So, what do you recommend today? If you could go back to talk to your former self, what would you have done so that he wouldn't have been able to do that?
Absolutely. This is what I teach my clients and my students is that I say there's a few key things that you need when you're dealing with contractors. The first is a contract. Don't just text them. Even worse, don't just call them. And an invoice is not a contract. Nowhere in, the invoices that we're getting does it say, this person is not my employee. The other thing I always check is to make sure they actually have insurance, and they're actually licensed. It's great if they have it on their, letterhead. It's great if they have it on their truck. I'm actually going to check those things. And it takes 5 minutes. It may sound like I'm overkill here, but it really doesn't take that long. If someone says they're licensed insured, they should be able to provide you with that documentation very, very easily and very, very quickly. And so that's not something that I take for granted anymore. And so number one, put it in writing, get, a detailed scope of work, especially if the person you're working with, which is the case with a lot of GCs and handymen, they're not operating as an LLC. They themselves are just Joe Schmo showing up to do work. And, we're small time landlords. We weren't, hiring, these national HVAC companies or, national people. So not everybody who we hire, and especially the investor friendly type of contractors, they're not, on the up and up necessarily with their legal either. And so we need to at least have certain bare bones. I don't care if you don't have an LLC, but I do care if you have insurance. And if you don't have certain things in place, I'm definitely going to need a very robust contract outlining what our relationship looks like with each other.
Got it. Okay. So if he had insurance in place, then that would have covered any injuries he he claimed he had during that time.
Or at least part of it. And maybe it would have covered the workers' comp or something like that.
Got it. Okay. Okay. That's interesting. So in terms of, I kind of wanted to just start with the basics in terms of getting yourself set up though, with entities. What is the structure that you recommend? Because I've had a lot of different people recommend different structures. So for the typical rental property investor, what do you recommend?
So, not to sound like every other lawyer, and perhaps this is different than what other lawyers are saying. It depends on you. And that's the thing. I never, as a lawyer, want to project my risk tolerance onto you. Some of these lawyers will be out there and say, you need all this convoluted stuff. And my thing to them is like, well, why don't we just open up an account in the Caymans? Like, where's the level of like, there's just maybe one step too many that it's just overkill. Because the biggest issue I see with investors is that they're creating structures that they don't know how to maintain. And if you're creating all these LLCs and you don't know where to put the money and you don't know who's signing the lease and you don't know who's getting the mortgage, then you don't have the asset protection because you have to use all these entities properly in order to get the benefit that they provide. Now, that being said, there's one major hiccup that I see. Would I love everyone to use LLCs? Yeah, they're a great bang for your buck. Does that mean you need 100? Does that mean you need one per property? That's up to you. What is going to make you feel good when you go to sleep at night? And for some people, it's like, hey, I'm willing to hold $1 million worth of assets in each LLC. For some people, it's one property per LLC. That can be a bit cumbersome when you start thinking about, how many QuickBooks accounts that can add up to be. But the biggest hiccup I see is your financing. People who are doing like house hacking, for example, which is a very common early stage investor, probably the best way you can get into real estate investing is by house hacking. And people who have an FHA loan, they can't, purchase that with an LLC. Am I going to tell them you shouldn't start investing in real estate because you can't have an LLC inside of trust, inside of Wyoming, inside of this, that, and the other? No, of course not. That doesn't make any sense. We can always balance things off with insurance and handling the rest of the legal stuff properly. I mean, I have seen people spend upwards of $30,000 creating entities just not to use it right or not to be, be on the up and up with the rest of their legal side. So it's a holistic picture. Where do you want to put your dollars? Where do you want to put your energy? And what's going to make you feel better when you go to sleep at night? And I can't tell you that, but I can kind of help you with that conversation.
Yeah, that's so funny you say that because I fell down that exact same rabbit hole. I've been investing for about 12 years now since I left the military. And initially I had a couple partners and we got linked up with this, law company that was selling from stage at conferences. And they set up the most complex legal structure and it was all fear-based, because you're going to get sued tomorrow and you've got to have 20 different entities. And then from a tax stand, like you talked about, those are all different QuickBooks and trying to track all the dollars separately. At the end of the year, trying to file taxes was another, you had to take out a mortgage just to pay for that. So you can entity yourself to death. So I love hearing that, sometimes a little simpler is better. When it comes to the actual type of entity, the actual type of LLC, do you have a preference? Do you just tell people form one in the state that you're buying in, or do you use a specific state?
Yeah, I want to touch on one thing you just said, and then I'll answer that question. Okay. The first thing is that you should never need asset protection from your asset protection. The whole purpose of asset protection is to maintain your net worth. And if you're spending your net worth paying lawyers and CPAs, it's not doing its job. And so with that, I'll just put a little bow on that and wrap it up. Now, the second piece of this, which was your question on, which state do we form this in, is a little bit more complicated because there are some states like California where it's like $750 per LLC, or Florida, which has a very weak single member LLC. And so I'm up here in New Jersey, in the greater Philadelphia area. I've got a line of clients who are like snowbirds. They've owned properties in Florida or Arizona. And so that's a very common conversation I have with them is like, hey, maybe we don't want to touch the Florida LLC. we'll do it, where we are, and we'll just register down in Florida as a foreign entity. Do I think most states have, a robust LLC? Yeah, they're all pretty much going to do the same thing. Does certain states, I know Wyoming, Nevada are like, I call them the designer bag LLCs, where they've got this little pizzazz about them, where there's less publicly or easily disclosable information about who's actually behind that LLC. Is that legit? Yeah, it is. Does that actually stop lawsuits? I seriously have doubts about that. I tell people all the time that, like, one of the things that happens when you go to law school is you get a bunch of lawyer friends. And so I've got friends who are personal injury lawyers. They're medical malpractice lawyers. They are like the lawyers that we as investors are afraid of. And I tell them, I ask them, I'm like, does this make a difference? They're like, no, because when it comes time to judgment, we figure out who's behind it and we get our money. And, we know behind every piece of real estate, there's one, the real estate, and two, an insurance policy in all likelihood. So we know there's a payday. You're not hiding anything from us. If someone is truly hurt, they're going to sue you and they're going to have some sort of recovery. And that's fine. That's why we have a justice system, right? We would want that for ourselves. Now, we don't want anyone being predatory, but that's also why we have things like insurance. Just because someone has a payday doesn't mean it has to physically come out of our pocket. And we should also just do whatever we can to prevent that situation in the first place.